Right. Well, Kibwe Tavares, is that how you say your last name?
Yeah.
Hey, well, my name is Martin Janssens. I am an MArch 1 student here at the University of Texas at Austin School of Architecture. And this is part of the Goldsmith interview series. It's just a chance for, sort of a more informal chat before your lecture,
Yeah.
to ask some questions as a student.
Sure.
So it's over here. Kibwe, as founder of Factory 15, which is a collective of collaborators which brings together architecture and storytelling and emerging technologies, and a senior, a 2020 TED senior fellow. You've sort of got this broad career path for an architect, and I've said this to many of the lecturers that have come here that I'm caught a bit off guard when researching, because there are so many different paths that architecture can take. Do you get that reaction a lot, that that going from architecture school like the Bartlett is sort of a different direction in terms of direction and animation?
I think so. I think what's I've sort of been lucky to. I think for what I learned at the Bartlett, I learned a lot about process, and I kind of learned a lot about I had a lot of space to kind of start to kind of define and we start to kind of learn how to kind of learn how to kind of approach creative issues or tackle creative challenges, and then so that kind of led me in really good stead to kind of allow me to kind of do lots and lots of different things. Me and as well as the studio kind of it kind of opened up our world in a sense, because something I kind of admit, what I really love about architectural training, for me anyway, for me kind of there's a lot you when you're designing a building, you learn it's made of all these kind of tiny little bits, and there's a lot about process that you learn, a lot about basically kind of learning how to kind of work out who you are and learning what you want to say. Also with the Bartlett, it kind of installed us with a lot of confidence and to just try go out and try stuff. So I think it kind of for me, it was an amazing experience, and I've seen lots of different people kind of have an architectural background and stuff and move into other things because the architectural training allows you to kind of just do other things, because you can apply yourself to lots of other spaces, basically.
Yeah, so it's more about harnessing a creative energy and where that
basically
energy can go.
Well,
I was just going to ask, what kind of title do you give yourself then? In terms of are you an architect? Are you a director? Are you what do you think of yourself as?
I think now now definitely kind of the work I'm doing more now. I'm more kind of a director and a filmmaker. I don't we still I still work within architectural space in terms of visualizing things, but I don't necessarily kind of call myself an architect anymore, because I'm not really designing buildings anymore. So I think I've gone into kind of a more linear kind of category now. I think there are probably times, maybe when I first started, maybe just after finishing the Bartlett, where it felt a bit more blurred in terms of what we were doing when we just started the studio, and we were just kind of trying to kind of do our first work that kind of essentially kind of started to kind of make our name as a company. I think it's probably more blurred then, but I think now in terms of recent years, the path I've been following is kind of more, it's more of a kind of filmmaker, I would say, a filmmaker and a director.
Do you think then that there are more connections that people, that their gut reaction to the links between architecture and something like filmmaking, that there are more links than we sort of understand at first?
I think they're definitely more interlaced. I think an architect's got a very similar role to a director, in the sense that you're the creative lead of a project, and then you work in sort of similar sized teams, and there's lots and lots of people that kind of working towards something that's an architect might kind of be the creative lead on the building, and then you have your project manager, who is effectively your producer in a movie. Then you have your structure team, your HVAC M&E team, and you have all the kind of different teams that kind of all plug into kind of trying to kind of make this one thing. And as a filmmaker, as a director, as a screenwriter in that space, you're the one that kind of drives what the vision of that thing is. So they overlap, and they overlap on lots of different ways as well. I think they overlap in terms of cost and price. For example, you can make, I remember kind of thinking of these kind of analogies, when lots of people's first feature films they're kind of relatively small, but you could they're almost the same as kind of your first building commission. And then as you sort of get bigger, like when you start, if you start getting big and start working on bigger projects, say for example, you work on a big blockbuster movie, that's like designing and building like a stadium or an airport. And they sort of cost, like a stadium could cost, you know, like 300, $400 million, same as like one of those massive movies. And then when you actually look at the numbers of people that work, and if you think of actually people on site, it gets comparable to the amount of kind of like people on set, or people on set or working in the kind of animation department over the course of the film. You can end up with like thousands of people working in these things for a similar sort of length of time as well. So I think there's lots of parallels in terms of like the actual making of a building compared to kind of making a film.
Is a strangely powerful overlap there in terms of the comparisons.
Yeah.
You know, going back to, I guess, your thesis, and when you left the Bartlett, moving into something like animation, was that more about impact? Like, did you feel like you could have more impact in that career path than you could as an architect, or was it more just about personal interest, like that was interesting to you at the time?
It was a bit of both. It was a bit like, and I'll kind of go into a bit more in my talk. I think when I was much younger, I was into animation and into kind of storytelling anyway. I was always into kind of video games. I learned very young how to kind of use 3D software, and I got quite proficient at it. Like, so I was always into kind of using that software. And then when I moved into architecture, I essentially carried on using the software, but to kind of like design buildings. And that but because I had good training, it almost became like a really useful tool. But I think when I sort of moved into filmmaking, I felt like I was excited by I felt like what the project I was working on as an architect at that time, I was working on kind of this big sort of like commercial housing project, which I didn't really feel fully connected to. And I thought like I kind of had this kind of like mind-blowing experience at the Bartlett, and kind of opened my eyes to kind of all these different ways of having a different output. And then I felt very constrained kind of going back to kind of like doing straight architecture and work, especially working on the building I was working on. I sort of felt like I was kind of had more to offer in a way. And I felt like as an architect, it was going to be hard for me to, because this was quite soon after the kind of the financial crisis, 2000, like I think it was 2010, 2011. And so like most practices weren't like, I felt that it was going to be quite hard for me to kind of either start my own architecture practice, or kind of like, it's going to be a long time until I'm trusted to kind of have my own voice as an architect. Whereas as a filmmaker, like people were more prepared to kind of like give you a shot, it felt like. So I could kind of like flex my creative muscles a bit more. And I was excited by kind of, also I felt like my architecture, in terms of like the designs I started to kind of look at, I felt like it's almost felt like these designs are interesting, but I don't actually want to see a real building like that, because it's a bit dark and it's a bit depressing, it's a bit sad. Although that's actually like, it kind of works better in fiction. And I sort of felt more sort of creative freedom within film, basically. And then so I was also really kind of drawn to sort of like seeing like where that would lead. I didn't really know where it was going to go. So there's always been a lot of like uncertainty about like, I was excited by that. So I kind of like followed that path, and I was like, look, I'm just going to try to see where it takes me. And then it wasn't like I had a kind of a clear like strategy of like, I'm going to do this and then this is going to happen. It was like, let me just kind of try and see where that goes.
Yeah. Did you find that like when you were at the Bartlett, that the institution and the sort of pedagogies that were being approached there were encouraging you to follow this path, or was it more like, you know, this is a personal feat?
So my tutor, a guy called Nick Clear, who like, I love him so much. He kind of like, he plants a seed really early on. When we first went into, because I'd done my part 2 there, because you know in the UK you kind of have part 1, part 2, and then your part 3 is professional. So in the first kind of like group meeting you have together as a studio, he kind of plants the seed like, do you really want to be an architect? There's lots of other things out there that you could kind of like go towards your, and then you're like, and then like, so basically once he planted that seed, over the course of the 2 years that I was there, I start to kind of question that. So it's not, they don't necessarily say, look, you should leave architecture and go do something else, but they do kind of make you question and do kind of plant the idea in you. And the whole kind of structure is set up so that actually like you're surrounded by lots of really, really talented people, one, and they work really, really hard. And my group in particular we were kind of like quietly competitive with each other, but also very supportive of each other. So we sort of like encouraged each other. And then by the end of it, we're like, how do we continue sort of working in this vein? And how do we continue to kind of like make the stuff that we're really enjoying making now? And so even before we had finished, we decided we were going to start a studio together. And that was Factory 15. So like it was basically it was like an incubator really for sort of like creativity, and it was kind of like, so they don't like push you that way, but they do plant the seed, or Nick did plant the seed.
Yeah. Why did you call it Factory 15 at the beginning?
It was a combination of, so basically our studio was called Unit 15 within the Bartlett School. And the way like our work ethic was quite relentless. So we worked sort of like we're like a factory, like there's something industrial about how we kind of churn stuff out. So we thought like Factory 15 sort of flowed quite well. We tried a couple of ideas at the start, but that was the one that sort of stuck, and it felt kind of like strong and felt like solid. And so it was a kind of a nod to sort of like how we kind of met and come together.
Yeah. Well, looking at the work that comes out of Factory 15, or even your work at something like Nexus, um, there's a sort of broad approach to visualization, right? There's a lot of different styles, a lot of different sort of clients even. Do you think that this is part of like a sea change in architecture visualization, where we're just sort of embracing these different modes of visualization and representation? Is it client driven, or is it really about the firms?
It's a combination. I think it's a combination of client, as I think it's like there's a kind of artistic desire to. It's a combination of sort of like, because basically like the software like gets kind of stronger and like the tech gets stronger, so it allows you to kind of do photoreal visualization a lot easier. So the craft definitely becomes within actually trying to add some story to the images. So instead of just saying, okay, cool, look, this is a completely kind of photoreal rendering of what you're going to get and what you're going to build, it becomes more about how you can entice people and how you can kind of sell an idea and how you can kind of sell a story with your product. So I think it's sort of driven by a combination of a few things, like kind of like a desire for companies to stand out and have something different, a desire from the kind of client also to kind of have something that also helps kind of like draw people when you've got a world of kind of like, and also kind of like and also how you sort of like how you kind of catch people's imagination. So it's not just saying, look, this is, and that kind of to do with branding as well as marketing. All those sort of things are tied up in like what drives architecture visualization, as well as, there's lots of companies who can kind of like do a perfectly photoreal kind of rendering of a bathroom or rendering of like an interior space. But like, if it's not evocative, like, why do you want to kind of like, how do you make it stand out? So I think that's why you've seen like the kind of like the landscape sort of change in recent years. And there's also, I think the artists get a bit fidgety as well. They're kind of like, why am I only going to just kind of like, what's in it? Like, what am I getting from like doing this perfect rendering of a bathroom? Like completely accurate, like what, like, so they kind of like, so I think that's also why it's sort of like exploding kind of like different techniques. And there's companies like, so we've always tried to kind of stay in like our visuals are strongest on the sort of more artistic end. But then you've got like companies like Mia, who I think they're Norwegian, who kind of do this amazing work. And it's so evocative. They kind of like think of it as photographers, as architectural photographers. And they kind of make this kind of these amazing like competitions. And each image is kind of so evocative. So it makes you want to go and visit the building. It makes you want to kind of like be there. It makes you want to, and then I think, so that helps all like the architects they use. It's always kind of Heatherwick or whoever it, like top architects that use them, because it helps sort of almost sell a philosophy into whoever's, if whoever the client might be too. So it goes beyond. And so that's where I think our work, especially in storytelling, especially our work in our film work, architectural film work, kind of feels kind of really strong, because we've got this kind of background in like direction, like as well. It's kind of like, how do you kind of like, people love stories. They want something that they're connected. They want to kind of like, they want something with emotion. They want something with feeling. So they kind of draw to play, not just like, not something that's kind of purely explanatory. And that's like led to kind of us doing a lot of like immersive stuff, as well as a lot of kind of like using a lot of storytelling in some architectural films.
Yeah, well, on that idea of immersion, obviously the world has been in the midst of a pandemic, of a multitude of crises over the past year. Do you see your work kind of changing because of that, in terms of shifting to things like augmented reality, and the fact that we can't just go to our friend's house, right? We can only see them through a screen. Do you think there's a sort of trepidation now towards hyper realistic environments, or is it more like we want to see more of that?
I think I don't know how things are going to kind of like change, but I think definitely even up to the pandemic, a lot of kind of we were doing a lot of this kind of stuff that was coming our way as a company was kind of like either events-based stuff or stuff that was much more about immersion and much more kind of about being somewhere, kind of like creating somewhere as opposed to showing something, about feeling something. Let me try and answer your question. Sorry.
It's like it was a kind of a broad, big question.
Yeah. But I've definitely seen like, and I definitely think like there's going to be like huge changes that are coming sort of like out of kind of like, you know, when everyone sort of like recalibrated and kind of like worked out sort of what just happened. I think you're going to see a lot of creative kind of changing. It's also going to happen from how people are working too, because the fact that like even like at the moment we're working remotely and we will be for a while. And so it kind of like what the way that the work comes out, you can still kind of try and do the same thing, but I think everyone has a slightly different feeling and approach and kind of like, so I think that over the next kind of coming years, as we sort of come out of the pandemic, you're going to start to see some quite big changes in kind of like what people are drawn to creatively too, and kind of what space means.
Yeah.
Physical space versus virtual, especially like now everyone sort of lives completely online. And physical over the years already is like for a while, like the kind of virtual space is becoming much more important. And so now where people are completely living virtually, through their work, through how they're socializing, through it's going to kind of have a massive impact on how we kind of perceive space, I think.
Yeah, and we're selling it now too with
Yeah.
NFTs or whatever. So
Yeah.
it's an interesting time to be an architect and an animator.
Yeah.
Well, I don't want to keep you from your lecture, so I'm just going to ask one more question here, and that's sort of the generic podcast question, right? There was well, since you're in New York, there was a New York Times article about hitting a wall, and so I'd just be interested in hearing like what's keeping your creative energy up, and what's keeping you happy and inspired.
It's a good question. Like I've like last year's been like, it's kind of been fruitful as well as tough. Like there's been projects that have come my way because I've managed to kind of take a stop break and look at everything. And I'm working on a really kind of interesting, I'm working on a fully animated project again now, which is kind of, it's kind of musically based, and it's set in Haiti. And there's a lot of world building, a lot of like fun characters stuff. And that's sort of driving my energy forward. But then I think for me, like personally, like I kind of like I had a kind of tough time with the last couple of years with kind of like some health stuff. And so like kind of like being able to kind of work again and being able to function again, and sort of like having the creative output is sort of like keeping me going, and kind of keeping me excited and engaged, and like creating again, like, lots of kind of like cool things on the horizon. So I feel really positive about potentially projects coming up, and I'll kind of turn the corner in terms of like some of my long form work, and there's lots of kind of exciting things I've been working on. I'm being a bit vague because I don't know how much I can talk about them in terms of actual detail yet, but I think that I've been lucky through the pandemic in the sense that like some of my projects which were tentatively happening have now actually started to happen because everyone stopped and been like, actually like this project was really strong, and then we've had enough time to kind of sit there and kind of get it over the line. So I feel really like, and these are both kind of like film projects, like dramatic, like feature film projects that are kind of happening now, that have been in development for a really long time, as well as sort of coming out of like quite a tough couple of years, like personally and health wise, and all these sorts of things that have been like thrown at me. So I sort of see like, not necessarily like the end of the tunnel, but I sort of see like a kind of exciting way forward, or exciting future again in some ways. And I'm excited to kind of like I don't think things are going to be normal again. I think, well, they may be in I don't know how many years, but there's going to be a kind of a different. I've been kind of struggling with this idea of kind of a new normal anyway, because of some things that have happened personally. So I'm kind of like, I feel like hopeful at least a bit about what next, even though like I'm very aware of like it's been super hard for most people. So it's not like, oh, I'm all right, like whatever, but it's just more like I think I've sort of like I'm feeling really hopeful about what next really. So it's a combination of a few sort of life changes, a few sort of like long-term projects finally sort of like clicking into place and happening.
Yeah. Well, thanks for being so candid about that. I think,
Yeah.
it's really encouraging to hear as somebody who is in his last semester, about to graduate, enter profession, and see that, you've ended up where you are, making the decisions that you've made. So thank you for chatting with me and coming to
Yeah,
the
thank you.
way. I'm looking forward to watching your lecture.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, the lectures, I'm sort of tracking my journey from even before the Bartlett right up into, I don't have so much of the recent stuff in there, but like I'm tracking my journey kind of like from the Bartlett into kind of film and how the process is from architecture connect with connect with the film stuff I'm doing now. So hopefully that's interesting. I don't know.
Oh, definitely, definitely
Cool.
interesting.
All right.
Okay, well, you
Okay,
can
cheers.
head over to the lecture, and I'll
All
see you
right,
later.
okay. Thank you.
Bye.
Cheers. Thank you. Bye.